The decree was not whispered through corridors, softened by palace language, or buried beneath careful protocol. It carried the full weight of a king's hand, and when King Charles signed it, the last remaining bridge between Prince Harry and the institution of his birth was severed. In one stunning act, the monarchy moved from hesitation to finality, and nothing inside the House of Windsor would ever feel the same again. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The moment did not arrive suddenly. It had been building through years of strain, public fracture, private disappointment, and the slow erosion of trust that once held father and son in the same direction. The royal decree, in simple terms, is a formal written order issued by the monarch that carries legal and institutional authority, and this one carried consequences that reached beyond ceremony into identity itself. Charles sat alone before the document, the weight of it pressing harder than any state decision he had made before. Harry's name was there, unchanged on the page, yet everything around it felt different now. The king did not move at first. He stared, not as a ruler calculating consequence, but as a father recognizing what finality looks like when it cannot be reversed. When he finally lifted the pen, it was not with confidence, but with visible heaviness, as though each millimeter of movement cost him something he could not recover. Years of warnings, internal meetings, quiet interventions, and emotional distance had led to this exact moment, and still it felt unreal even as it was happening. The palace had prepared the decree long before the public knew anything about it, locked inside a restricted file that only a small circle of advisors had access to. Those few who knew did not speak openly, and even among them, uncertainty lingered about whether Charles would ever go through with it. Some senior aides believed the pressure would ease, that a softer solution would prevail, but when the final instruction came, it shocked even those who had been closest to the process. Meanwhile, far from the palace walls, Harry received the news in silence, that quickly turned into something heavier. His expression hardened, not in anger alone, but in the slow realization that this was no longer a warning or negotiation. This was ending, a severing, written into royal authority itself. The message did not need embellishment. It carried its own finality. And as Harry absorbed it, the distance between him and the crown stopped being emotional and became absolute. The decree was not only about titles. It was about who inside the palace believed the monarchy had reached a breaking point, and who had quietly prepared for this outcome long before it was ever announced. But before the ink could dry, the true pain of the decree began to move through the people who had once called Harry family. A royal decree may look cold on paper, but inside the palace, it landed like a private wound. Charles was not only a sovereign making a decision, he was a father cutting through memory, loyalty, anger, and grief. William saw duty, Camilla saw danger, Harry saw rejection, and somewhere beneath the royal language, a family that had already broken in public was forced to confront what could no longer be repaired. Charles stood at the center of it all, carrying two identities at once, monarch and father, and neither could protect him from the weight of what had been signed. Harry, the son stripped by that same signature, became more than a subject of royal process. He became the emotional fault line of everything the monarchy had been trying to contain. William, as heir, understood the crown not as sentiment but as structure, and he knew structures survive only when certainty replaces hesitation. Camilla, standing beside the king in spirit, if not always in comfort, felt the pressure of a throne that hardens every private choice into public consequence. The decree did not only remove titles, it reshaped identity itself, pulling Harry out of ceremonial standing, inheritance proximity, and the symbolic language of belonging that had defined his entire life inside the institution. William stood near a window, after hearing confirmation, silence pressing against him harder than any argument. He did not speak immediately, because words would have made it personal in a way he could not afford. Then, Finally, he said the monarchy could not survive endless exceptions, and the sentence hung in the air like a verdict already accepted, but not forgiven. Charles, elsewhere in the palace, drifted into memory for a brief moment, seeing Harry not as a name on a document, but as a child running through corridors that once felt safe. That memory made his hand hesitate before resting again on the decree, as though the paper itself had grown heavier than the crown he had sworn to carry. Camilla feared that anything less than a full decision would stretch the crisis into something permanent, something that would never settle, while William believed delay had already weakened authority beyond repair. Both fears pointed in the same direction, but neither softened the cost. Harry had expected punishment in some form, a reduction, a restriction, a controlled response, but not the complete removal of every remaining title that still tied him to the institution of his birth. That difference made the blow sharper, more personal, and impossible to interpret as anything other than final separation. Somewhere inside the palace, advisors understood that this was no longer about management, but about consequence becoming identity. And beneath all of it, buried under protocol and silence, lay the moment that had forced Charles beyond restraint. A moment not yet spoken aloud, but already shaping everything that followed. And behind that final signature lay one hidden moment that convinced the palace there could be no return. Every royal rupture has a moment people later pretend was only one more argument, one more misunderstanding, one more storm passing through the palace walls. But this one was different. Long before the decree was signed, long before the announcement stunned the world, there was a closed-door confrontation after a Windsor remembrance service that left Charles shaken, William cold, and Harry dangerously close to a line no one could ignore. The tension had been building for years, slow and corrosive, never fully breaking, because Charles refused to turn family pain into formal punishment. He believed distance could be managed, that time could soften fractures, that duty could hold what emotion could not. But after that service, something shifted beyond repair. A Windsor Remembrance Service, in simple terms, is a private royal gathering held to honor past service and national memory, where family presence is meant to signal unity rather than division. Yet unity was not what followed when Harry confronted his father in a quiet side room away from ceremony. Harry did not raise his voice at first. He spoke with the weight of someone who had carried disappointment for too long, asking Charles what place he truly held now, not in public tradition, but inside the family itself. Charles stood near a side table, still in the shadow of the service, and listened as his son's words cut through years of careful avoidance. The king's expression shifted slowly, first into sorrow, then into exhaustion, as if each sentence was pulling something out of him he could no longer protect. Harry's anger was not loud, but it was precise, shaped by memory, by exclusion, by the sense that access to family and future had become conditional instead of certain. When William entered moments later, he stopped immediately. He saw Charles standing still, one hand resting on the back of a chair, not for comfort but for balance, as though even the weight of silence was becoming difficult to hold. No one spoke for several seconds. That pause became its own statement. It was during that confrontation that Harry rejected a proposed limited role inside the monarchy, a structured arrangement meant to preserve partial connection while drawing clear boundaries around duty and distance. Harry refused it completely. He demanded recognition that the palace believed it could no longer grant without destabilizing the entire system. Recognition in this context meant official acknowledgement of status and place within royal structure, something that determines not only ceremony but identity inside the institution. William heard enough of the exchange to understand that the conversation had crossed into irreversible territory. Later, a private phrase spoken in that room was repeated quietly among senior discussions, described only as the moment everything stopped being negotiable. Charles did not correct it. He did not deny it. because even he understood something had ended without needing permission. Harry would later attempt one final conversation, believing there might still be space for repair, but that meeting did not soften the fracture. It sharpened it into definition. And that buried confrontation did not fade with time. It waited in the shadows until Harry and Charles stood on opposite sides of the final door. The most devastating royal decisions are rarely made in public. They happen in rooms where no cameras enter, where every pause sounds like a verdict, and every word carries years of buried pain. When Harry faced Charles for the last private exchange before the decree moved forward, it was not a negotiation. It was a father and son standing in the ruins of trust, each waiting for the other to surrender first. The room itself felt stripped of ceremony, as if even the palace had withdrawn its language and left only truth behind. No aides stood between them. No officials softened the air. Just Charles and Harry, locked in a silence that already felt irreversible. Harry had come with one purpose: to stop what was already in motion, or at least slow it long enough for explanation to exist. He wanted reversal, or delay, or something human enough to break the mechanical certainty of royal procedure. But what he found instead was a process already leaning forward, already moving beyond emotional reach. Royal procedure, in simple terms, is the formal system through which decisions become official within the monarchy, requiring only the monarch's authority and administrative execution rather than family consent. Harry placed both hands on the table, the tension in his arms revealing everything he had not said in years. He asked Charles directly whether he was choosing the crown over his own son. The question did not echo, it sank. Charles remained painfully still, not avoiding the answer but absorbing its weight. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost worn down by the repetition of impossible choices. He said the crown had already been damaged by years of uncertainty, and that love, no matter how deep, could no longer rewrite duty once the system had begun to fracture. Harry's breath tightened, because what he heard was not rejection in anger, but rejection in resignation. Then came the moment that removed any remaining illusion. Harry was told plainly that the decree did not require his agreement. It required only the monarch's authority and the palace's final administrative execution. No negotiation could stop it now. No appeal could pause it. Charles then set the unsigned file between them, and that single gesture transformed everything. The document was no longer theoretical. It was waiting to become irreversible history. Harry stared at it, understanding that the line he had been fighting against had already been crossed somewhere without him. Charles did not touch him, did not rise, did not soften the moment with explanation. Because even he could feel it now, the machinery of monarchy was already tightening around the decision, closing ranks, sealing pathways, and preparing to move forward regardless of emotion. And in that tightening silence, Harry realized the truth that mattered most. The real power behind the decree was not anger or heartbreak alone, but an institution aligning itself to carry it out. Once that door closed behind Harry, the decision moved from family heartbreak into the cold machinery of royal power. Behind every royal decree stands a room full of people who will never wear the crown, but understand how power survives. By the time Charles acted, the palace had stopped treating Harry's status as a family question and started treating it as a constitutional threat to clarity. William knew the future was watching. Camilla knew hesitation had a cost, and the courtiers knew the king had finally crossed from pain into command. The decision did not remain inside emotion for long. It moved into structure, into language, into carefully constructed lines that would decide how history would read the moment. A royal decree, in simple terms, is a formal authoritative order issued by the monarch that becomes final once it passes through legal and institutional approval. That process pulled in advisors, legal drafters, household officials, and senior consultations, that turned personal rupture into administrative certainty. Each step removed emotion and replaced it with procedure, and each procedure made reversal harder. The palace framed the decision as necessary, not as punishment, but as protection of the monarchy's structure, ensuring no confusion remained about who represented the crown and who did not. Structure, in this sense, meant the legal and ceremonial framework that defines royal roles, titles, and public authority. And once that structure is challenged, the institution reacts with precision rather than sentiment. William received the proposed language before final approval, reading it in silence that carried more weight than disagreement. His eyes paused longer on Harry's name than on any other line, as if the word itself held memory. Then he approved the direction, not with anger, not with celebration, but with a quiet resolve that suggested acceptance of consequence rather than approval of outcome. Camilla watched Charles after one of the final briefings and noticed something no document could hide. When Harry's childhood was mentioned in passing, the king's gaze shifted away, just for a moment, as though memory itself had become difficult to face directly. That small movement carried more truth than any official statement. Within the advisory circle, there had been voices urging restraint, suggesting a softer settlement that could preserve connection without full separation. But stronger voices inside the palace argued that partial measures would only delay conflict, leaving the monarchy exposed to repeating cycles of dispute and public uncertainty. William's position, whether spoken directly or absorbed through his influence, carried decisive emotional weight, because he was not only the heir, but the one expected to inherit the consequences of whatever decision was made. His approval did not create the decree, but it anchored it. Once that final structure was set, the machinery of execution began without hesitation, and as it moved, there was a quiet understanding among those closest to the process that the first consequences would not wait for public announcement or ceremony. They would arrive elsewhere first. And when the palace machinery finally moved, Harry discovered that a title can vanish from paper before the heart has time to understand it. The morning after a royal life changes does not arrive with thunder. It arrives with messages, missed calls, rewritten references, and the awful quiet of realizing the world has already adjusted to your loss. Harry woke to a reality that no protest could soften. The titles were gone. The palace language had changed. And with one decree, the identity he had carried since birth had been removed from him in public view. Notifications did not announce it with emotion. They arrived with sterile precision, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. But everything had. Inside palace systems, names were already being updated. Official records, ceremonial lists, invitation drafts, seating protocols, and internal directories began reflecting the new structure without hesitation. Each change reinforced the same truth. The decision was not pending, not reversible, not waiting for interpretation. It had already become fact. The way Harry would be addressed, where he would be placed in future events, even how he would be referenced in institutional memory, all shifted at once, under the weight of administrative certainty. He sat with his phone in his hand, reading the updated wording once, then again, as if repetition might reveal a mistake. It did not. The screen did not change. The language did not soften. And slowly, he lowered the device without speaking, the silence around him heavier than any public announcement could have been. Meghan watched him carefully, anger rising first, protective and immediate. But beneath it, something deeper settled. Not shock, recognition. The recognition that the institution had finally drawn a clean line through their lives and decided which side they belonged on. She could not undo what he was seeing. She could only witness it with him. Behind the scenes, several palace departments had already prepared revised language before the public ever heard a word. That meant the transition had not begun after the signature. It had begun the moment the decision was finalized. as if the machinery had been waiting for permission to move. And once that permission arrived, everything accelerated without pause. Harry began to understand something more unsettling than the loss itself. The decree had not been designed as a warning or a negotiation tactic. It had been designed as completion. A finished act with no ceremonial path back, no softened return, no hidden doorway left open for reversal. That realization settled in slowly, but once it arrived, it changed the shape of everything he thought might still be possible. Yet even amid the machinery, the statements, and the silence, the deepest shift did not come from advisors or documents. It came from a private exchange that no institution could control, no courtier could draft, and no palace office could rewrite. And in that moment, everything that followed began to narrow toward one unavoidable meeting, where two brothers would face each other without anyone standing between them. Yet amid the machinery, the statements, and the silence, the deepest shift came when two brothers faced each other without anyone standing between them. For years, the world watched Harry and William through ceremony, interviews, distance, and carefully managed silence. But the moment that mattered most was stripped of palace language. No aides, no lawyers, no official notes. Just two brothers standing in a private room, carrying childhood memories neither could erase, and adult wounds neither could fully forgive. In that stillness, the decree stopped being a royal document and became a family ending. The room felt smaller than any palace corridor, not because of its walls, but because of what it contained. Two futures that no longer aligned. Harry entered first, not as a title, not as a figure of controversy, but as a brother, trying to understand what had been taken from him, and why it had been allowed to happen. William followed, slower, as if each step carried the weight of something irreversible already accepted. This was not a negotiation anymore. It was aftermath. The meeting had no agenda, no structure, no palace framing to soften the edges. Only truth, exposed and unprotected. Harry spoke first, asking William whether he felt relief now that the decision had been made. The question was not angry, but it was sharp, cutting through any space for avoidance. William did not react immediately. When he finally answered, his voice was steady but tired. He said he felt grief, not relief, and beneath that grief, a sense of responsibility he could not step away from. Responsibility, in simple terms, meant accepting the consequences of decisions made within the monarchy, even when they fractured personal bonds. Harry heard the words, but what hurt him more was what came next. William admitted that the monarchy had reached a point where it could no longer defend half positions, where someone could not remain both inside and outside its structure without tearing it further apart. Harry had expected anger. He had prepared for blame. What he did not expect was calm acceptance. That calm made the distance between them feel final, because it meant William had already mentally crossed the line that Harry was still standing on. The future king had already decided what the separation meant, and that realization landed harder than any accusation could have. For a brief moment, neither spoke. The silence between them carried something older than politics or duty. It carried Diana's memory. Both brothers understood what she would have thought of this distance, how it would have broken something in her, how she would have tried to pull them back together, even when neither of them knew how. But memory alone could not rebuild what had already fractured under pressure too heavy to contain. Harry looked at William, searching for something that still felt familiar, but found only restraint shaped by responsibility. And William looked back at Harry, not as an opponent, but as something he could no longer reach without breaking something larger than himself. The silence ended without resolution. There was no apology strong enough, no explanation complete enough, no royal authority left in that room to close the gap between them. And once they parted, it was no longer a private conversation. It was the final separation of two paths that had once been one. By the time Harry walked away from William, the private wound had already become a national spectacle. By sunrise, the decree was no longer a palace secret or a family tragedy behind closed doors. It belonged to Britain, to broadcasters, to front pages, to crowds outside royal gates, and to every person who thought they understood the House of Windsor. The monarchy had acted with ruthless clarity, and the public reaction arrived with equal force. Disbelief, approval, outrage, sorrow, and the strange silence that follows history when it happens too quickly. Broadcasters broke into morning programming with urgent framing, calling it the most dramatic royal severance of the modern reign, a moment where tradition and emotion collided in full public view. Royal severance, in simple terms, means a formal separation within the royal structure, where a member is removed from official status, titles, or roles, reshaping how they are publicly recognized. The language was sharp, but the reaction was sharper. Newspapers split instantly in tone, some calling Charles a wounded father forced into impossible duty, others declaring him a decisive monarch, protecting institutional clarity at any cost. Commentators argued without pause, each interpretation pulling the story further away from simple explanation and deeper into national debate. Outside Buckingham Palace, the human reaction was quieter but more personal. An elderly woman stood near the gates, wiping her eyes as she spoke to a reporter, saying Harry had been born into it, even if he walked away from it, her voice breaking not in judgment but in sadness. Nearby, a younger supporter outside Kensington Palace pushed back against criticism, arguing that William had done what was necessary to protect the future of the crown, turning loyalty into a generational divide that was visible even in tone and posture. The nation was no longer speaking with one voice. It was splitting along emotional lines, each side carrying its own version of loyalty. On the front page of a major newspaper, a stark black headline read, "The Last Title Falls," placed beside a solemn image of Charles, his expression unreadable, the weight of decision captured without words. The image became a symbol overnight, repeated across screens and conversations as if it defined the entire monarchy in a single frame. During a live broadcast, a respected journalist paused mid-sentence, then said the decree had not only changed Harry's title, but had redrawn the emotional map of the monarchy itself, shifting where loyalty, distance, and identity now belonged. That phrase lingered, because it suggested something deeper than administration. It suggested transformation. Beneath all the noise, one truth began to form slowly. This was no longer just about a prince and a title. It was about what the crown was willing to become to protect itself. And as the public storm intensified, attention turned from reaction to meaning, toward the question that would not fade with headlines. What did this moment reveal about Charles, about Harry, and about the monarchy that now stood between them? But beyond the headlines and the crowds, the decree's true verdict was written in the hearts of the people it left behind. In the end, the decree did not simply strip Harry of titles. It exposed the painful truth at the center of monarchy. Love may shape a family, but duty defines a crown. Charles signed as king, suffered as father, and accepted that history would judge both roles at once. Harry lost more than words before his name. William inherited a clearer future, and the monarchy chose survival over sentiment. The storm that followed was not just political, it was personal, cutting through memory, identity, and the fragile belief that family could always outrun institution. A royal decree, in its simplest form, is a sovereign order that becomes final through the authority of the monarch, leaving no room for negotiation once enacted. And once that line was crossed, the monarchy did what it has always done in moments of fracture. It hardened itself to continue. The arc that began with tension, moved through confrontation, and exploded into public division, now settled into something colder but stable. Finality replaced uncertainty. Hierarchy replaced ambiguity, and the line between private affection and public duty became unmistakable, drawn so sharply that even memory could not blur it. Charles stood alone after the storm had passed. The room no longer filled with advisors or pressure, only silence thick enough to feel physical. He removed his glasses slowly, placing them beside the signed copy, as if even the act of seeing the document had cost him something irreversible. His expression carried exhaustion, but beneath it, a quiet acceptance, the kind that comes only when choice has already been replaced by consequence. He did not look victorious. He looked finished in one part of himself, yet still standing, because the institution required him to. Somewhere far from the palace, Harry sat with the understanding that the battle over titles was no longer something to fight, not because the pain had disappeared, but because the door had been closed by something larger than emotion. Acceptance did not arrive as peace. It arrived as silence. A silence that acknowledged what could not be undone. Charles did not sign because love had ended, but because love alone could not answer what the crown demanded in moments of collapse. The monarchy required certainty where family required compassion, and he chose the path that could be measured, recorded, and enforced. William, standing in that same shadowed outcome, understood that his future reign would begin here, in the echo of a sacrifice that could not be reversed. Clarity came at a cost, and that cost was visible in everything that had been lost between brothers, between generations, between memory and responsibility. He saw not triumph, but inheritance, shaped by consequence. Harry's absence as a titled royal was no longer a possibility or a debate. It was fact. The monarchy had drawn its line, and it would not blur it again without risking its own structure. This was not simply separation. It was definition, and definition, once set, becomes identity. The final truth was unavoidable. Charles did not choose punishment over Harry. He chose survival, for the crown, when no softer path remained. William inherited not just authority, but the emotional residue of that decision. Harry stepped fully outside the institution that once defined him, carrying the weight of what had been removed but not erased. And the monarchy continued forward, altered, sharpened, and permanently marked by the choice it had made in silence. And so the final verdict was clear. Harry walked away without the titles. Charles remained with the burden. William inherited the consequence. And the crown survived by closing the door forever. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.